Greetings, Earthlings. We are the Metalunans. We come from the galaxy of Metaluna. We have come in the nick of time with our great mothership in order to save you from very, very serious situations. We are going to cure the pandemic for you. We are going to provide you with all the natural resources you need. We will give you jobs working on our mothership, creating all kinds of holographic things and doing all kinds of weird science that you don't understand. And we've basically just come to save your butts. Psych. Buongiorno here, being a jerk with his interplanetary regalia and his 3D glasses, which I had to make, by the way. I couldn't find any. I made them in honor of the fact that we're doing Society of the Spectacle today. You guys don't really realize, like, all the links I go to make things palatable and entertaining, and just don't appreciate it, you little bastards. It's like, I don't know. Anyway, Society of the Spectacle. We're going to get back into Society of the Spectacle today, but we need to finish up with our discussion leading into the book by Debord, Society of the Spectacle. We were talking about some of the main dynamics, some of the main components of this Marxist or Marxian analysis of capitalism, and we need to round that out. And we also need to talk about the ways in which the system has had crises in the past and continues to have crises up to and including the crisis that we are in now, which is significant and somewhat frightening. And I'm going to do a little back history, going to define some concepts before we actually get into what Debord has to say. But I think we're going to find that Debord's analysis of what he considered to be the spectacle, how he defined the spectacle, is something that we unfortunately are in a situation right now where we are seeing the most hyper-intensive version of the spectacle that has ever been attempted. Oh, and it happens to coincide with another circus of terror on its way, in a way that dovetails in a very, very frightening way. And that has to do with the fact that the pandemic itself has been spectacularized through the media, and the media, being the hydra-headed beast that it is, doesn't really... I mean, ultimately, they're kind of like following their mission statement. Their mission statement is always what? You know, to make us panic, to make us be fearful, to keep us separated. Debord is going to talk a lot about separation as being the end product of the entire process. And that's a very controversial and eye-opening assessment of the situation. All right? What we are seeing play out in terms of the spectacle, this war of opinions, is really something that one can only liken to some great, like Game of Thrones or Star Wars or some great Shakespearean tragedy. Certainly not one of the comedies, definitely one of the tragedies. But it boggles the mind. Any reasonable, anybody that still has some shred of civility and education and understands history and understands the place of government at certain times in our history, if you really, really understood it, I think that you would be screaming from the top of your lungs outside your window like Peter Finch did in Network the last lecture. Today I heard that, and I don't want to like kick this to death because we have a lot of things to go into, but we need to talk about certain things that, you know, I would strongly suggest. I'm going to get back up on another COVID-19 update, and I am going to aggregate Some of the things that are being said in the independent media that run counter to what our august paragons of elected virtue are attempting to foist upon us. The kind of bullshit that they are hauling at us via catapults. These catapults of shit that they are heaving at us right now should leave one trying to get out of the way of it. Literally trying to get out of the way of it. We have a pandemic crisis, and giving Cuomo his due, it's like I said it before, the guy has risen to the occasion, he's taken the baton. We have to understand the agenda. We have to understand the agenda here, and when he comes out into a press conference and makes the statement that the curve has flattened, it is not coming from the World Health Organization. It is not coming from the CDC. It is coming from an elected official that needs to be reelected. All right? Putting people back to work. Getting people back out there. All right? This economy, and there's a couple of different people involved in the situation. One of them is the Donald. All right, Tweety Bird himself, who needs to get this economy going again due to the fact that he's going to he needs to get reelected. Based on, there's no other way that this guy's going to get reelected unless he does it with the mechanisms of industry moving again in some way to say that I saved the economy. All right. In saving that economy, there is a risk-benefit analysis, and we all know what it is, my friends. We all know what it is. It is the same situation. If anybody ever saw the movie Jaws in this class, the movie with Jaws with Roy Scheider, it was, for those of you who never saw it, it took place in a community in Long Island, a tourist community, where, for whatever reason, this gigantic man-eating great white decides to feed in the local beach community, off the shores of the local beach community, and just starts ripping people apart en masse. All right, and the mayor. So Roy Scheider plays the county sheriff, and then the mayor comes, and they know this thing is still out there. They know this thing is still out there, but it's May, folks. Tourist season is just about to start. So what do? Under duress, and Brody, the sheriff, quite admirably, is like, we can't. There's a man-eater still out there. But the mayor says, no way. We got to open those beaches. First day of Memorial Day, everybody's out on the beach, and what happens? A little boy, a little 8-year-old boy, is torn to pieces by the great white that's still lingering out there. That's still out there. All right? And we can liken the situation to that. Opening up the beaches before it's safe for political expediency and for political reasons. All right? We got to get real with this. We got to get real with what the true interests of the people that you go into the ballot box to and throw the levers for every 4 years or whatever, what their true interests lie in and what your interests are. And we have to be able to start making distinctions between these things. We need to be able to start making distinctions between these things. I know a lot of people are out of work. I've had to go and claim unemployment myself for all the subbing I do. But we need to recognize the fact that this is a serious, serious situation. And we need to hold tight. If we need to hold tight, we need to hold tight. And we'll talk more about what led up to this today and why we're unable to, why we're not coping with it very good. And we're not. We're not. You know, the whole world has basically dropped the ball on this, but this country in particular has dropped the ball and let it. I mean, some places have dropped the ball and picked it back up, kind of like my local thing. Other places, we've dropped the ball, we've dropped it in a drastic and catastrophic way, and we need to be aware of that. We need to be aware of that. So, so that's my little rant for today, but we're going to go back and want to hit some bullet points and reminders really quick about Douglas Lane, the host of the Zero Squared podcast and the publisher of Zero Books. We're going to be talking with him. Remember, we're going to be on Collaborate next week at Tuesday. I'm going to give out, I'm going to send reminders to you guys. I don't think we have to do a test run. Hopefully everybody will be able to get on that needs to. If you can't, for some reason, if you have a job conflict, I know some of you are working still, let me know ahead of time. The other thing is rough draft of the midterm papers, due the same day. I'm already hearing back with people that are having some difficulties with it, and we're working it out. I'm helping to, I'm kind of playing the role of what the Writing Center would usually play, and helping out those of you who need help in terms of structuring your paper or thinking it out or coming up with or really understanding the prompt, which I know that I've been kind of remiss in not going over the way I should. But I think a lot of it is, it's like, you have 5 options. The first option is, in ways of seeing, John Berger charts and analyzes many of the conventions of modern images in relation to their origins in classical oil painting and the Western perspective. The prompt is to choose one of the 3 chapters. Now remember, and I stress this, the chapters that we're talking about in Berger are not the chapters with the pictures. There's chapters 1, chapters 3, and chapters 5, which are the 3 main chapters before the final chapter, which would be, in this system, chapter 7, right? To take one of those 3 chapters and take the assertions, take 3 assertions made in whatever the particular chapter you choose, and apply and basically connect these assertions to the general conclusions that he makes in chapter 7 about publicity. All right, so that's it. That's where you have to limit yourself. All right, to just taking, because each of the preceding 3 primary chapters deals with a different aspect of classical representation that culminates in what he has to say in chapter 7. And chapter 7 we'll find, chapter 7 and episode 4 of Ways of Seeing really kind of dovetails with a lot of what Debord wants to say in Society of the Spectacle. He just says it in a more extensive and elaborate kind of way, tying it more to Marxist ideas, and we have to get to that. And the second one has to do with comparing Sontag to Berger, some of the things that Sontag says in Plato's Cave. I take out quotes from her that are definitely comparable to some of the things that Berger has to say in Ways of Seeing. And that's just a comparative, that's basically just a comparative essay comparing what the two have to say about specific things. Number 3 is basically comparing Sontag to Bazin in terms of the ways they look at the photo as being the undisputed record of reality. how Bazan, in his own way, like says yes, he's a realist, and Sontag, basically says like, well, it's she's not as sold to the idea of verisimilitude and indexicality that the photo has as Bazan does. Remember, she's writing 30 years after that. Number 4 is got to do with Benson's article on the ontology of the photography from analog to digital, talking about the transition from analog to digital as a major transformation. And that one is basically to summarize Benson's argument and agree or disagree. And you got to make reference to at least 2 of the theorists he talks about in that essay, either Bazan or Sontag or Barth or Sartre, Baudrillard. Number 5, John Berger writes in chapter 7 of Ways of Seeing, and I give you guys several quotes from the final chapter, and then Peter Benson, on the other hand, makes some assertions that are somewhat comparable. And John Berger makes these statements concerning publicity over a decade before the first digital cameras. Benson, writing more recently, makes a strong connection between the proliferation of the digital image in the 21st century and the basic plot premise of the Matrix. Remember, Benson does make reference to the Matrix. So this one is basically you using chapter 7 on Ways of Seeing and Benson's article and connecting both of those, connecting both Berger and Benson to the Matrix. How are they all kind of saying the same thing in different ways? There's a number 6. Number 6 is one that you may or may not venture upon, depending on how deep you are into this and how deep of an understanding that you have about Society of the Spectacle. But it's basically a comparison of some of the things that Berger asserts, primarily in Chapter 7, and some of the things that Debord has to say, and how these things are kind of connected. So so those are the capsule reviews, of what the options are and what you need to do. And I didn't want to spend a lot of time on them, but I figured that it was in our interest to bring them up and talk about it. And you can call me, you can send me your rough drafts early. Remember, it's just a rough draft, and we'll go from there. All right. We'll talk more about it. All right. There's going to be a thread on Blackboard to upload them, but if that's not working out, as Blackboard, has a propensity to do, which is not work for us, you can just email it to me. All right. But let's, I know that these are difficult times, and the paper that I'm asking for you. I know one student reached out to me and he wanted to do option 1. And option 1 is hard, really. It's kind of hard. Not hard, but I need to kind of work through it with him. So we'll get on that. You know who I'm talking about. So we got all that going on. And we're going back to what we were talking about with Marx. What Marx defined as being false consciousness, alienated labor. We went through the different systems of economic distribution that have happened over history and what has stayed the same in all of those systems and what has differed. We talked about false consciousness, how the bourgeois, or the ruling class, creates this entire system using the mass media and consumer culture to pull the veil over the eyes of the oppressed and the proletariat, to convince them through distraction and through all kinds of false promises to kind of keep everybody in line, and We see that. The thing that's important to understand in this idea in capitalism of wage labor, of turning your time and your expertise and your a huge chunk of your waking hours into labor, going to work, is that not unlike the commodities that you are producing, not unlike the raw material that the employer is bringing in for you to change into a coffee, or a sale of hi-fi equipment, or a call servicing center, how many calls you put out. All of that is commodities. But within that entire equation, your labor becomes part of that system of commodities. You're part of what is being bought and sold on the market, all right? That you are reduced as a human being in this system of wage labor to a commodity. But the commodity is basically your labor power and what you're and not only your labor power, but for instance things like there's this competition that goes on about in terms of how good of a commodity you are. It's like if this one commodity, this one guy shows up an hour late every day, as opposed to this other person who's on time every day, the employer, as such, gets to make a decision about what commodities he wants to keep and which ones are more valuable and which ones he doesn't. He or she doesn't. Or, for instance, the one guy in cubicle A has a tendency to make 42 calls an hour as opposed to the 23 that the guy in cubicle B is in. He gets to make a decision at that point. It's like, wow, this commodity, this one commodity, that I'm deriving profit from is it's not functioning like this other commodity A. Let's get rid of commodity B. Let's get rid of them. All right. It's the way that this employer-employee relationship has gone on from time immemorial, that we sell ourselves, we sell our bodies and our brains on the line to the highest bidder. All right? And we see the ways in which this thing turns monstrous, especially in a system where unemployment is running rampant. What people are willing to do or not do to survive becomes grotesque. All right? It becomes grotesque. And in many ways, the chapter that, you guys didn't read it. We read it in the other class. Talking about things like the sex industry, or prostitution, or sex workers, how women are reduced to having to sell their bodies on the street, or the ways in which people have to, sell drugs in their community and poison their community. I was just talking to a guy the other day that got out of jail, a guy I know that is back to dealing, and I'm like, well, it's like, it is what it is. He's like, well, I got to make the money, I got to make the money, I got to bring home the bacon, I got a kid. Not doing the risk-benefit analysis of realizing that, I can set my watch to the time where they're going to pick him back up, and then he's going to be a real use to his kid, But this whole grotesquerie of the ways in which we are commodified and forced to do certain things in order to survive, is alarming. We're turned into commodities. Living labor is what Marx will call it. How we're bought and sold on the market. How we vie for competition in job interviews, and how we cozy up and, we go into these job interviews. Personally, I want to start this, I want to start a hobby of going into job interviews that I really have no interest in taking the job, but I want to go into like job. I want to do this thing just to amuse myself of like going into job interviews, like dress like famous historical characters and like playing that, like going in as Caesar, just to fuck with people, just to amuse myself. Because at this point, I need a lot of amusement. We'll talk about some of the alternatives to capitalism that are springing up, and we'll probably see more and more of as the next few years progress. Somebody had asked me in the blog about worker co-ops and collectives and how that way of operating, this whole idea of democratizing the workplace operates, and how it's becoming more and more of a model for fair situations. Another thing we have to understand about the capitalist system is that it was always kind of sold in its original conception, and many of its original theorists, everybody from guys like Adam Smith to John Maynard Keynes to other like people who were attempting to analyze, to Thomas Piketty recently in his book on economics, has always tried to understand the market, the free market of capitalism, as this self-correcting, healthy organism that always tends to rethink itself and renew itself and restabilize itself due to its own inherent dynamics, and that capitalism always kind of comes back from the grave, and everybody is all right once again, as if it were this thing, and as if it were real, as if it were a real entity. All right, but that's the way it was always looked at, and for years and years it remained stable. But the fact of the matter is that the real history, the history that they don't want to tell you in most economic departments, has to do with the fact that when we look at capitalism historically, it is highly unstable and has had, for instance, since the Great Depression of 1929 and the 2008 crash, and which was a major catastrophe, there were 11 other business downturns between those two periods. So for anybody to assert the idea of capitalism being stable, it's like Richard Wolff likes to say. Richard Wolff has this thing, he says, like, to his students, he says, if you had a roommate that was as unstable as capitalism is, you'd be looking for another roommate. That's how unstable it's been. Consistent downturns, consistent crashes, consistent instability that usually involves government, and this whole big thing about like not having any government regulation. No regulate. It's like, it will take care of itself. Government just needs to leave their cotton-picking hands off of the economy, and it would do exactly what it needs to do for everybody involved, and everybody would benefit. And we've seen time and time again, the ways in which certain situations spring up that force the government to. And the government had to come in 2008 and bail out the banks with all this money. And all these people that were all these conservative, economic conservatives and neocons, who were like, oh, you don't mess with the market. They kind of turned a little bit around in their thinking and said, could you please lend us some money? And that's exactly what's going on again. It's exactly what's going on again. Because the market cannot be trusted. It can't be trusted. And we may be seeing God forgive me for saying it, but it needs to be said. The red pill needs to be administered, and it needs to be said. We may be seeing the final death throes of this system and having to deal with the consequences. You and me and everybody else on this planet. All right? But, hey, it's like no one said it was going to be easy. Capitalism unstable. Not the most stable thing in the world. Marxist socialism. What Marx had to say was that sooner or later, people were going to, through education, through what he called class consciousness, and an informed citizenry, he would ultimately assert that at some point capitalism would not be able to contain its inner contradictions any longer. It would tap itself out and it would implode due to its own excesses and inadequacies, and that implosion would be started by a class of people that would finally see how badly they were getting ripped off, how raw of a deal that they were getting, and would ultimately rise up and stop it, and just stop it. Did that happen in other countries, in other circumstances? Plenty of cases where you see situations where illiterate peasants, didn't even have to read the Marx to understand, to organize. Che Guevara, the guy that so many people now wear intaglioed on these T-shirts in the ultimate form of recuperation, was one of those people. People that started these peasant revolts because they had it. And it happened many times, many times. Were the implementations of Marx's ideas after the fact always sound, or always somewhat convoluted? Or yeah. We've seen numerous instances of the entire Eastern Bloc, the entire communist Eastern Bloc, like imploded on itself. But we have to understand that the implosion of the whole Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc, one could make the case that a lot of that had happened due to corruption, due to the fact that the managers and the heads, the apartchiks as they're called, and the inner circles of the Soviet political mechanism were skimming and taking money that wasn't theirs. One could almost make a case, all right, and I think it's a cogent case, that it wasn't communism itself that imploded, but it was the capitalist elements of it that really kind of deep-sixed it. So the proletariat society would take control of the means of production, and there was this belief that was going to happen, and that it was going to happen worldwide. And of course, it's like a lot of neo-Marxians now, after the fall of the Soviet Union, are in the in the somewhat dubious position of being like, wow, it seems like this thing, we thought this thing was just going to collapse. Obviously it hasn't, due to the fact that capitalism is, once you're in a system, man, it's very, very hard. It's like when you're in a system that's got its hands around the throat of every political, social, and economic aspect of life. It's hard to get out of it. But we're seeing more and more. With communism, all the evils, and he was an optimist. He thought that, sooner or later there would be this workers of the world would unite in this common undertaking and free themselves of their masters. I want to point out something about this slide. This slide is an older slide. This is a slide that I had incorporated in this PowerPoint lecture for the last 3 years. And it has to do with the end result, and it was kind of tied to the original, it was kind of tied to things that had been said about the rising rate of unemployment after the 2008 crash, and what wide-scale unemployment has a tendency to do to us socially, psychologically, and spiritually. All right? And this, all right, so this slide was put together a couple years ago, all right? Well before the current millions and millions of people that are now unemployed and what people are experiencing, being locked up, all right, and being told by the powers that be that it may get to a point, and I'm going to be posting a lot of shit in the next couple days. I feel it to be my civic obligation, my obligation to the truth as a human being, my obligation to, you as my students, to let you know what's going on. That the situation is kind of sizing up in a lot of different places, abroad and here, that we may find ourselves in situations where the necessity of social distancing will be enforced by the military law, the law enforcement military apparatus actually being given the powers, powers due to the state of exception of enforcing you to stay in your house, all right, under either the edict of issuing a ticket or going as far as doing it at the end of a gun, all right? It's like we need to know that there's a good conversation that goes on between Glenn Greenwald and Edward Snowden. I got to post that about everything that's going on in terms of data surveillance right now and the cost-benefit analysis of getting all this personal information. You guys know the deal. And they also go after the automated agriculture industry and how our absolutely abominable, wasteful, unsanitary practices of agriculture and food procurement are basically the foundation for this pandemic. All right, things that could have been stopped if a decent regulatory mechanism hadn't been dismantled due to this current, pack of wolves and the pack of wolves that came before them. All right. What is low-paying jobs and unemployment do to people? Let's see. Side effects of unemployment and low incomes. 1, physical disease. Folks, this was from a couple years ago. Physical disease. Mental disease. Mental disease and the proliferation of not having health care, not having the proper diagnoses, or being cut loose from shrinking social services, and people are just allowed to spin off into madness. Crime. That's a no-brainer. Crime always goes up, irregardless of of how they cook the books about the rising and lowering of violent crime. It's bullshit. All right. Crime always rises when there's unemployment. It's like the moon. It's like the sun coming up in the morning. All right. Drug addiction. Oh, jeez. It's like who would have? I'm beside myself. I'm just absolutely. How can there be some correlation between unemployment and drug abuse? They seem to be two entirely different, unrelated phenomena. It's like if a person, whatever. I know that my cynicism and my sarcasm right now is a little bit too much maybe for some of you to handle, but it needs to be said, my friends. It needs to be said. Children do poorly at school. Who would have thunk? Children doing poorly at school. Breakup of relationships. The dissolution of the family. Poor relationships. Poverty. Drug addiction. And, and I'm just going to say on a personal level, because I always use anecdotes. As a substitute teacher in the public school districts, due to these ensuing factors that have been the soup du jour of the ways in which that has a direct effect on children's behavior in school. When your father's in jail, when your mother's in jail, when your father's out selling drugs, it's like, well, there's nothing to eat in the house. What do you think that we're going to inherit when I go in and sub? What do you think I deal with? All right? And what do you think breaks my heart to the point of tears when I have to see it? All right? What do you think we're going to inherit with all these kids come back? They're not going to be happy, folks. They're not going to be well adjusted. They're going to be suffering from a form of PTSD that usually we only see in war veterans that have seen direct action, direct conflict. That's what we're going to be dealing with. All right? It's like Bongiorno's like going out on a limb and being a little bit of the Nostradamus with his, attendant crystal ball here. I know I'm going out on a limb. I know I might be, doing a little too much projecting, looking into my Palantir for some of you Tolkien fans. But what we're looking at, folks, is not going to be good in terms of behaviors. And it's going to break my heart. It really is. Breakup of relationships. I don't want to scare off anybody with a graph, all right, with numbers on it. I know some of you right now are, doing as much as you. It's like, oh my God, he just put up a graph with numbers. It's like, it is time to flee. This is starting to feel a little bit too much like my stats class, which is like waterboarding. But we need to look at some of the things. We need to look at a couple things specifically about the American economy that you need to understand. And you need to understand what has happened historically and why we have been in the situation that we have been in since 2008. How did it all happen? In a system that was supposed to operate and function so perfectly for everybody. The free market was supposed to, trickle down economics and everybody, it's, and I might have to, bring it a little closer for you guys to see it. There was every reason in the world to believe that the economy, the capitalist economy, specifically in this country, there was every reason to believe for about 150 years that this was like a really, really good way of doing things. Specifically due to the fact that for a lot of different reasons and due to a lot of different factors that we will go over, the United States, the U.S. economy and the U.S. as a country were optimum situations for this thriving of capitalism to occur. All right, and we'll talk about why in a second. But if you know it, and Richard Wolff kind of puts it back to about 1805, even like 1805, 1810. That there's this rising. There's a red line and there's a yellow line, and there's this, and the red line, the red line represents wages, specifically real wages. All right, and this upward incline in what people were making, and here it's from about 1945, right around the World War II. And goes to about 1975, all right? Real wages rise in this country, and real wages will rise in this country even before that, all right? It's like even in the late 19th century, due to industrialization, real wages in this country rose, all right? What are real wages, all right? Let me explain to you what real wages are. Real wages is just an economic term for wages that reflect. Real wages are basically what your wage will buy, what the amount of money you make will get for you adjusted for inflation, because there's always inflation. So real wages is the actual gains that you are making when you get, for instance, like a $2 raise. You know, it's like a $2 raise. A $2 raise is only meaningful. Let's say like you get a raise for $2 an hour, but everything in the grocery store is adjusted. It goes up at a rate of like, you know, the same percentage as the raise you got. Then there's no real wage increase because everything kind of stays flat again. That inflation like compensates for the money you get. It's like prices go up, you get a wage, big deal. You're spending more anyway. So real wages are always a reflection of what you can buy, your buying power in relation to what things cost. So this goes on, so that there is this, and the other line represents what is called productivity. What is productivity? Productivity is the profit that is being made by employees, whether it be small businesses, corporations, large businesses. It is the general, I'm not going to say it's the GDP, because GDP, the gross domestic product, is a little bit different. We're talking about the amount of money that a company is making. Companies are making, whether it be a pizza shop down the street or Google, all right? This rise in productivity, all right? The rise in productivity is the rise of profit, as liquidity, as capital. This is how much we're making. We're making this much. If you notice this graph, this index between productivity and real wages, something happens. It even says here, something happened in the mid-70s, all right? And this is what happens. Productivity continued to rise up until now, really. This only goes to 2015. But real wages stayed stagnant through 1975, 1980. They go down. 1990, 1995, 2005. It's like they stay the same. They stay the same. What does that mean? That means that there's no real increase in, standard of living. Before this, the system is working so that, each generation for a very long period of time, my great-grandparents, my grandparents, my parents, and even myself, there was always this idea, this overwhelming, this American truism that you were always going to do better than your parents, and your parent, and it's like my grandparents, like many of your grandparents were immigrants, or your great grandparents were immigrants. You're from a different generation, and they came and they sweated and they sweated it out, and they worked really hard, and they put together some stuff to get their kids, to give their kids something, usually in the form of maybe an inheritance or a job or a business or whatever, and it's like, and that would happen, or it's like, my parents didn't go to college. My father was a bricklayer, my mother was whatever we call it in the current, feminist climate. She was a homemaker. And they never went to college. It's like me and my brother and my sisters, we went to college. They made that happen. So that one generation did better than the next. Guess what we're seeing now, folks, and guess what we've been seeing for the last 10 to 20 years? Situations in which this new generation not only are not doing as good as their parents, but not even on par. Not able to afford houses, not able to afford the hell with like luxury items. That we're seeing this downturn. And it's very marked, what's going on, to the point where, it's like people, it seems as if, prospects are drying up, kids moving back with their folks. A lot of that is happening right now. There's a lot of kids moving back. There's a lot of kids. There's a lot of like middle-aged people moving back into their parents' houses right now because they can't afford to live out there. All right. So I want to explain like what happened. Why did this happen? Why did it happen? First of all, what made capitalism flourish to the degree it did in this country for such a long period of time? What did it that the U.S. specifically in the U.S. because in the U.S. for the longest period of time it was capitalist nirvana from the early 1800s on. And why was that? Why? It's like one of the primary things was due to the fact that we had this incredible parcel of land between the Atlantic and Pacific Ocean that was just teeming with natural resources and fish and game and all kinds of like metals and natural reserves and oil and all this stuff. There was this incredible, once we like eradicated the people that were here already, which is like a little sidebar of the story, how we like ethnically cleanse. Once we like clean them out, and put them in these little places, so then it was like, that's cool. Now we can do whatever we want, right? And we had this incredible amount of natural resources ready to be used in this industrial process, to the point where, industrialists and employers, for a long period of time, and probably up until like 1974 or 1975, we got a labor shortage. There's all this stuff that needs to be done. We don't have enough workers. We don't have enough workers to like man the factories, to do the stuff, to build the bridges, to mine, to pull all this stuff out of the ground, to cut down all this wood and turn it into timber, to use all this hydroelectric, building stuff, building stuff. We don't have enough workers for a while, folks. We don't have enough workers, and what happens is that we need to go and import workers, all right? And we do it in two different ways. We do it in two different ways. The first way is through immigration, right? Through immigration. We need workers so that there is this huge exodus between like the 1880s and the early 1910s of primarily European immigrants who make a decision, and these decisions to come, people don't just like get up one day and say that I'm going to risk a hazardous voyage across the Atlantic, in steerage. And some of my Italian immigrant great aunts and great uncles were like stowaways on ships. They risked a lot to come over here. You don't make those kind of risks unless there's some kind of reward going on. And the reward was that it's like employers were willing to pay wages, all right? And also, the other scenario that we see during this period, specifically in the 19th century in the South, is instead of getting immigrants, they just go out and just get people, under the lash, and they bring slaves in. They use slaves down there. They go to all these, they go to, the Dark Continent, and, they're like, okay, we're here. It's like, we need like 300 people to get on this boat right now. All right, we need 300 people to get on this boat and come across, and come and work for us. And, some of them said like, no, we ain't going anywhere. And our response was, who else doesn't want to get on the boat? And that's the way that system ran. So we needed labor. We needed to procure labor. We needed to get labor. So we did it in a couple different ways. The bosses, we have to understand one thing about capitalism when we were kind of talking about it the last time. If the bosses do not have any incentive, nobody, out of the altruistic goodness of their heart, decides, it's like, my employees are doing so good, I think I'm going to bust into my capital resources and give them more money. No one does it. Nobody does it. You need to have an incentive to give your employees a raise, and it usually has to do with it had to do with a couple of different things. One was the fact that there was still for a long time there was still a labor shortage. The employee didn't have the upper hand to the degree that I need these people, because there was always the option for immigrants. There was still like a lot of undeveloped territory out in the middle state, out in the Midwest, and it's like if you weren't raising a factory worker's wages or garment worker's wages, they would just say F it and go and live. They were used to living like peasants. Why not? So that there had to be incentives, and industrialists had to have some kind of incentives to keep their labor. So they give you, it's like, and this is where organized labor comes in, and the unions get involved and start representing the workers, and there's a strong union movement that is predicated on this idea of collective bargaining and striking, because we're still at a place, remember, where the workers got a lot of power. The workers got a lot of power because they can just like say, we're going to, it's like there's these negotiations or better work conditions or better wages, or outlawing child labor or whatever it is. The unions, this whole affiliation of different unions gets together. There's a history of that. One of my students in the other class is reading this history of I'm not making anybody do anything. Read this history of modern labor and why it's gone awry. So so the bosses have to raise wages to keep workers, right? That's going on. This starts to change in the mid-'70s. Why does it change? Bonjour's got to check the time. Why does it change? There's some changes that happen. All right? We hit a saturation point of having enough workers. We no longer have a labor shortage. We finally got, even with the abolition of slavery, we finally got, it's like enough workers. There's no longer a labor shortage. It's all accounted for. In fact, there becomes a surplus of labor. All right, a surplus of labor to the point where, and it happens. And it happens due to a couple different factors. All right, first one is computers and automation. All right, computers and automation come in. The assembly lines become automated. Everything that we're still seeing. This increasing the use scans, Target, Walmart, blah blah blah. It's like if a machine can do it, then you don't need like people to do it. All right, so there's this whole automation fact. So that it's like living labor employees don't have as much power because the employees don't need them as much anymore, and all of a sudden there's this whole area of the unemployed. Now there will be other periods of rampant unemployment too. Specifically in the first depression, I will talk about how that was dealt with. The other thing that employees started to realize, especially around the time of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, those two ghouls of outsourcing. Corporations start to realize the fact, hey, wait a minute. It's like, we got these guys. It's like, we don't need these guys anymore. They're making $27 an hour with full pensions, full health, dental. It's like, shh. We can go and get people to do this stuff in the Far East and India and these other places for $1 an hour, 13 cents an hour. So we don't need these people anymore. So we can just go and outsource the jobs. That's the other thing that happens. And that's the climate that people that were working in supposedly paternalistic corporations throughout the century before that, places like, let's see, GE and IBM and Westinghouse and all these great paternalistic companies that promise you the world, all of a sudden, during the 80s, there is this pandemic, dare I say it, of fear amongst people getting let go. And they're being let go in waves, all right? And they're being let go in a way that was, let's say, fairly undignified. That You had instances, hundreds and hundreds of instances, say at IBM, where people that had worked there for 25 or 30 years and given their best, due to this outsourcing and not needing you anymore, were literally approached, on a Thursday afternoon, and told to clean out your desk, and were escorted out by a security guard to make sure you didn't take anything other than what was yours. And that happened for a long period of time. People just being absolutely shit all over by being out in front of your coworkers, being like ushered out in front of your coworkers, like being put in the corner with a dunce hat. That was a level of respect, that the boards of directors and CEOs and upper level management had for these people who were their friends, and it happened over and over again. All right, outsourcing. All right. Well, it's like once the living wage of like people stays stagnant, it's like people, in order to like keep up with paying the bills, it's like now it's like inflation's going up, productivity's going up. We got to find different strategies as a society to bring in more money to the household so we can pay the mortgage, pay the heat, pay for kids' braces, junior braces, all that stuff. One of the strategies that happens at this point in the mid-70s is that women go out to work. Women who had for a very, very long period of time, the tradition had been that and this is not about feminism. There was a lot of feminist elements to the idea of women being able to go out into the workforce, but there were downsides to that too. A couple downsides first. Two of the most important downsides. One downside is the fact that, all right, now mom is going out to work. There is this whole other list of expenditures that we have to get in order for mom to go out to work. She's got to buy clothes, sometimes business clothes, buy this whole new wardrobe. Mom might need a second car. Mom needs all this other stuff so she can go to work. So that's got to be figured into the equation. Mom's not home when Junior and little Sally and the rest of them come bouncing in. Mom's not home. Mom's not working. Or mom's too tired to cook. Go out and have fast food. Bring in the fast food. Fast food is expensive, folks. We all know that. And what is it? And it's not very good for you either. So that there is this so the mother's not home. And sometimes they're working swing shifts. Mother and father are both at work. We have this whole phenomena called latchkey kids. Latchkey kids that come in and the parents are both at work. Maybe they're working, it's like, and that, there's babysitters involved. There's but whatever was considered the sanctity, the robust healthiness of having like a strong maternal figure at home, that starts to erode. That starts to fragment and fall apart. So that we start to see the, dare I say it, dissolution of the nuclear family. And how the nuclear family that was so sacred for so long, like George Bush Sr.'s Dan Quayle, family values, family, it's like the whole Christian right, extolling the virtues of family values on one side of their mouth, and on the other side of their mouths, making the whole concept, the whole organisms of the nuclear family impossible. That's the hypocrisy that we're dealing with, folks. That's the hypocrisy. So mom's got to go to work. What else do we start doing to keep up with the Joneses? What else do we start doing? For the longest period of time in this country, you made enough in terms of real wages that you would have, and here's another term for you that people have a hard time understanding. It's called a living wage. What's a living wage? A living wage, people have this misconception about what a living wage is, all right? People think, they have this somewhat misinformed idea that when we start talking about providing people for a living wage that it has to do with. People think at this point that they've been so ripped off. They think that a living wage involves just being able to pay for the necessities, right? Pay for the rent of the mortgage, pay your car payment, and be able to eat and stay in a pair of shoes and a new shirt every once in a while. All right. People think that that's what a living wage is, folks. That's not what a living wage is by definition. What a living wage is by definition is this, all right? A living wage involves all that. A living wage by definition, and a living wage that was achieved by most people, most able-bodied people in this country for a very, very long period of time, involved being able to do all that, pay for all that, and then have some reserve money to put away into a retirement account or a savings account, or save for junior to go to college, or maybe later on after the kids leave the nest, we got all this excess income, we can go buy a boat, we can go buy a cottage up in the Adirondacks and just fish and have a pension and all this stuff. The living wage involves having this kind of surplus. Living wage is all that, being able to pay your bills and have a surplus. All right? That's what a living wage is, all right? That graph that I was showing you guys, where it starts to drop off in the mid-70s, there's got to be a way of being able to continue to have this illusion of a living wage without actually... Sorry, I had to restart the battery there. I had a battery problem. So it's like, how does one, deal with the fact that your wages have flattened and they never rise again? Since the 1970s, real wages have flatlined while productivity has continued to skyrocket. But how does one shore up the gap? Because before this, employers were providing enough money for people to not have to go into debt. One can say that Einstein's theory of relativity, or the invention of penicillin, or putting a man on the moon were great intellectual achievements. One of the most devious and greatest intellectual achievements in the economic system was the invention of the credit card. The credit card was a relatively new phenomenon in the mid-70s that allowed people to go out and purchase things on money that they didn't really have yet. And that, they would go and buy stuff on credit, and then they would have to dip back in to their real wages to compensate for it, all right? But here is the problem with credit. And we found this out. Everybody finds this out at one time or another, depending on whether you pay your credit cards or not. But credit, it becomes this never-ending cycle of paying the debt off. That, sooner or later, it's like you're not making enough weight. It's like you're playing catch up all the time, and you're never caught up. And then the gap starts to widen and widen for a lot of people. And that's when all the stress starts. And that's when all the tension starts, and that's when all, your credit rating, and that's when people start to run around in this kind of and it's like people, like these poor misguided souls that are pathologically attached to checking their credit rating like they check their cell phone, in order for that all-hallowed estimation of your personal worth, your credit rate. It's like, people's credit, we start to, and now there's this whole mechanism, and we've seen it all over the Far East, of like, equating your credit rating with what they're calling like your social rating, and it's just, it gets really, really ugly being in debt. And this is what happened, and this was the culmination. What ultimately happens in the crash of 2008 is a variation on the credit card. is a variation on the credit card. Was the issuing of like mortgages, you know, like people, it's like you couldn't give them away. You couldn't give mortgages away enough, you know, to people that were bad credit risk. But they didn't care because they knew that they could make money predicated on the fact that they were bad credit risk. It was called what would later be called by Henry Giroux casino capitalism. All right, it's like this goes on. All right, and I'm on the wrong one. So there's that. All right. So what happens by the mid-70s, and we'll have to get back into this next time. Well, we have a few more minutes. As the graph I showed you indicates, it's like the people continue to make the same amount of money, but the employers, the corporations, and the shareholders, and the boards of directors are making more and more and more and more. And there was a folk tale that capitalism created. There was this modern mythology, not unlike Pandora's box or Hercules' 8 labors against the Hydra or Theseus and the Minotaur. There was these mythologies that the mass media, in conjunction with the corporate state, told people about why corporations were doing as well as they were. And it had to do with these great heroes of capitalism that came in, the entrepreneur, the maverick entrepreneur that came in and saved the corporation due to their sheer, they were like the James Bond, like Lee Iacocca, and all these books come out at this time, you know, extolling the virtues of how Lee Iacocca comes in and saves GM by sheer dint of the fact that he's the superior eugenic species of intellect and economic reason, that he comes in and he saves the corporation. Jack Welch, he saves GE. You know, this myth of the great man theory. Once again, we have the great man theory that gets promoted, and the rationalizations that the CEOs and the boards of directors start to tell themselves about how through their lonely efforts of overcoming all adversity, you know, and seizing the lost ark from the Nazis under the most, they're heroes, they're American heroes, you know, and Trump's book, you know, it's like whatever it's called, you know, these mythologies that celebrate, you know, the CEO, you know. So the CEOs come back to society at large and say, well, since I saved the company, I think I'm entitled to the victor goes the spoils. To the victor goes the spoils. And this is what corporations told the public, why they were flourishing. And we all bought it. We all bought it. We all bought the commercials with Lee Iacocca walking in front of these thriving, you know, Chrysler cars. We all bought into it, you know, and we also like looked the other way when, for instance, the average wage ratio of CEOs to workers in the mid-70s. You guys know ratios. I know you guys do ratios because I do ratios with middle school students all the time, so I know you guys understand this little piece. In the 1970s, the ratio of a CEO to a worker was about 43-1. That means that a CEO of a corporation was usually making roughly 43 times as much as the average worker. Today, and this was one I dug up from 2018, Bongiorno does his research. Today it is 400-1, my friends. Today the ratio between the CEO and the worker in terms of wages is 400-1. How did that happen, you might ask? We'll get into that. Well, we're going to have to get into it next time because Bongiorno just screwed up. And didn't put on the thing again. So why is it that that happened? We'll just end with this really quick. We're gonna end with this. So the situation happens, all right, where there's this huge network within all the rest of the situation. There's this huge growing inequity between the rich and the poor, which would later be called, inscribed in the meme, the 1% and the 99%. And we're going to have to get back to this because I want to talk about the Great Depression. I want to talk about Roosevelt and what he did to save capitalism. And I want to go back and do a little history. I want to go back before 1970 for us to understand why this disparity happened when it did. All right? And then we'll get into Debord. Then we'll finally, I promise you we'll get into Debord. No questions asked. All right? So let's get our papers in. Let's keep reading Society of the Spectacle. I'm going to get out at least one more lecture on Society of the Spectacle before we have Douglas Lane. That will make us officially caught up, I think, in terms of the calendar. And we'll go from there. But sorry for so much of the red pill today. I think that we need it. I think we need to think about stuff. I think we need to think about what's going on. And I think we need to speak the truth to each other. I think we need to do it in a spirit of a fellowship, because we're being, it's like yesterday. It's like I went over to a friend's house. I know I'm violating social distancing, but it was just the three of us, her and her husband and me, and we had Easter dinner. And I was given the task of doing the prayers. I don't know where people's religious leanings are, but I was just thinking about what we were going through, and I was just, and during it I broke down into tears. I broke down into tears about what's going on, and I'm not immune to what's going on. I'm a pretty tough mofo. But just like you, I'm unsure. But I'll tell you one thing, and this is true of Bongiorno from the beginning to the end. I will go down swinging. Bongiorno will go down swinging, and he will go. And it's like, I assure you, as sure as I live and breathe, Bongiorno will continue to keep on playing the role of Morpheus and giving you the red pill. We will be getting into Society of the Spectacle. I wish you well, and we'll see you next time.